Hello everybody, this is John Baroli. I am the lead programmer with the Plan B Club, and today I thought I'd go over the OAuth workflow as it applies to Infusionsoft and integrations using the API and REST. Mostly we're going to cover the actual workflow and understanding some of the particulars, and I'll have a code example towards the end that will make it a little clearer. First, let me illustrate what we're talking about. If I go here, there is a test application or a demo application that you can find on GitHub. I've adapted it slightly so we can see what we're working with, but essentially provides a link to illustrate this. Somewhere in your app or service you can have the opportunity by a button or automated process to ask a user to go ahead and authorize their app so that you can perform a software as a service, campaigns, campaign tools, other services and applications. And so whatever method you use to get there, you'll be asked to log in if you're not already logged into your Infusionsoft account, and then you'll be given the opportunity to select one of the apps that you have access to by your ID, click allow, and it will return to the calling function the JSON string, and we can get rid of that, the JSON string that will contain the tokens necessary in order for you to access through the API, etc. So some of the problems that we found are misunderstandings with what OAuth is, and we found that there is big concern, particularly with developers, about having to change code in order to use OAuth, and also management of the tokens and keys. So this is an effort to try and clear some of that up, let you know what progress has been made in those areas, but for the most part to be able to illustrate exactly what the process is. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to cover, we're just going to go over a little highlight first, and that is to say we will first talk about why to move to or to use OAuth, and then I will describe to you what OAuth is and is not. Using OAuth and Infusionsoft together, the workflow for it, as well as covering token management and token use and implementation. So why move to OAuth? Why use it? We already have a system that works, an API key system. It's a single sign-on. It's simple. What's the reasons for it? Starting with deprecation. Infusionsoft has said quite adamantly that at some point in the future they will deprecate and phase out using the API key method. They cannot give you a date at this point. They don't know. There are some particulars to work out before they go full bore on that, and the reasons why we'll kind of cover as we go along, but generally it's what I've already mentioned, that we don't want to have our customers having to authorize every 24 hours, and we don't want to have to change code that already exists because it's using a different API that's structured differently. So the concerns there from deprecation are valid, but there have been some strides made, and I'll cover those in a moment. Infusionsoft Marketplace, you cannot, as a general rule, place any of your applications or services that use the API or integrations or REST without having OAuth compliance. I'm not sure if they'll make an exception given extreme circumstances, but I can't really think of anything that would really apply there. So for security's sake, there is a number of reasons. Three-legged authentication is definitely more secure because you can't tie the authentication information from one step to the next over the internet. We all know that we can capture information, but associating it with information regarding the previous calls, you just can't do it very easily. And this is also part and parcel to do with PCI compliance. PCI compliance requires that you do not send all information collectively. For example, I cannot send credit card information and the user or owner of that credit card's information collectively in one unit. So what happens is the data packages are sent, we get a token back, then a data package that's associated with that token gets sent, and we get another token back, and so on and so forth. And that's how they keep it secure. That's part of PCI compliance. So for security reasons, they keep this, that's one of the reasons why there is an expiration time on the tokens, which is 24 hours, again, for PCI compliance. Also, there is API metrics. Currently with the API key method, there's no way for you to know where you stand as far as token use or API call use on that token, and you can't really get counts of how many calls were made, for example, find by email or a add with do check. You can't really get information on that unless you track it yourself. Of course we could, but the fact is that it would be a lot easier if we had a central way to do it. So for API metrics, OAuth also lends itself well to that. App level call limits, basically you can specify, or the user can specify exactly what app they want access to. That was also the case with the API key function, but the API key function comes with further complication in doing that, and I'll explain that in just a moment, which is to say app level authentication. Now, app level authentication means that if I have a service and I allow it access to my app, then what that means is that the app, given the current past method, the method being deprecated, the API key method, what's going to happen is if I have a security problem or think somebody has stolen that that used to work for me, say a disgruntled employee or what have you, in order for me to change the app key, that I would have to be willing to invalidate all integrations that I have, and that could be substantial for many people. If you think about WordPress plugins and custom integrations and third-party apps and tools and campaign tools, and there's just a myriad, and if you really think about it, I would say it's not a stretch to say at least 50% of all Infusionsoft apps are indeed using some form or some level of API integration. Cross-implementation, that means that when I authorize a connection between myself as the developer and an app, a specific app that I've just been given authorization for, that means that I can also use that same key on that same app using REST or API. I can use curl, or I could use PHP wrapper, or the SDK, which has been adapted for OAuth recently. So, and we'll cover that as well. So those are the things to be aware of, and those are the reasons for switching to OAuth. So what is OAuth and what is it not? Let's start with what it is not. OAuth, contrary to what the impression may be, OAuth is not an authentication protocol. OAuth, we tend to look at it, especially if you haven't worked with OAuth before, and this is my story. I had an issue with this starting out trying to figure out OAuth, and I had a real brick wall that I hit because I was looking at it as if it was an authentication protocol. OAuth is better put as being a method in which you can manage the workflow for authentication, and it applies to a number of authentication protocols, but in this case, as Infusionsoft uses it, it just lends itself well to it. But it is more of a management than it is a protocol, and so essentially that's what the next point says. OAuth is an authentication workflow manager. So basically, I tell OAuth, here's the address, the web address I'm going to send you to. Here's some information I want you to send along with it. And when somebody does something, or the endpoint I give you returns any information, I want you to give it back to me, and then I'll tell you what to do next. And essentially, that's what OAuth does. So here's the OAuth workflow. Now, before I get into it, let's be clear on one thing. The terms that OAuth uses might confuse Infusionsoft users because they are also usually business owners or people who work for business owners, and terms like client do not mean the same thing in the OAuth workflow. So in this respect, client means the developer or the website or the service that will be requesting access to a owner's app or the resource owner. Authorization server is basically the gateway that gives or denies permission. The resource owner would be your customer or the owner of the Infusionsoft app, or potentially a user within an Infusionsoft app that is allowed access or given permission to give permission. And then the resource server is the server in which we make the API calls and retrieve information from or write information to. So the process works like this. We first have to get authorization from the user. This requires the actual activity or action of a person. And the person is verified by a login. They have to log into Infusionsoft if they're not already logged in. And then they have to give permission by selecting the app and clicking Allow. And they will get this screen right here. It's rather small, but you saw it earlier. And they can select the app that they have access to and click Allow. And when that happens, they go ahead, the Infusionsoft authorization server goes ahead and sends back an authorization token. Now, being specific, that is not your access token. That token is to give you permission to request your access token. It is not an access token. That's one of the things that have easily been misunderstood by people, especially those trying to use curl in order to manage this process. So this is a good time to give a warning to those, because I'm seeing a huge number of people trying to do this. Do not use curl to manage this process. You can use curl to manage your API calls, you can use curl to manage REST, but you cannot successfully, permanently use curl to manage authentication. The reason why is this. This screen right here, if you try to use curl to post to it and automatically get it to allow access, what you're doing is manipulating the form and then submitting it, and Infusionsoft will detect this and blacklist your IP address. It may not happen the first time, but they will see you as spam. They will see you as a viral attack. It is part of their firewall rules, and it will get you blacklisted. Now, you can get unblacklisted, but if you keep doing it over and over again, they're just going to tell you no. So don't do it. This is not meant to be done in any way except by human hands. Sorry, I know it's inconvenient, but there is a way to manage this, and I'll go over that so that you don't have to have this screen come up every 24 hours. So what happens, you get your authentication token or your authorization token, and then you go ahead and send back the authorization token and say, okay, me as a developer has been given permission as the resource owner to use their app and have access to it, so can you please give me a token that represents that access? That will become your access token. That is the token that happens right here in this JSON string. Access token comes back, and there's your access token. Don't worry about me showing you these pieces of information. I will invalidate them before you ever have a chance to use them. So no emails, please. So I get the token, and I'm able to use that token in order to access resources on the server, which include API calls and the database information that represents the details and information, contacts, orders, etc. on that particular Infusionsoft app. That is a general workflow. So specifically speaking, for OAuth Infusionsoft workflow, there is a resource page that gives you code examples in a number of languages, and they have a number of wrappers for it that you can use, including Ruby and .NET and PHP. So go ahead, hop over there and take your pick out of what they offer. You will find it a lot easier. I prefer not to use curl and other direct methods like that, just personally, because I like PHP. But whatever method you use, this is a resource that you can use to get the support files for it. So the first thing you want to do when you want to prepare for doing this, getting ready for using OAuth, is you need to set up a mastery ID. Now, mastery ID, all this is you setting up an account and getting credentials. So if you're not already registered, and this is not your Infusionsoft ID, by the way, just so I can avoid any confusion, this is your developer. This will be your developer ID, and anybody can get a developer ID. You don't have to do developers for a living. So if you go to register, it's going to ask you for a bunch of information, standard stuff. gives you information about the call limits and whatnot. You agree to the terms, you register, and then it will ask you for information here, like the name of your app. Don't get too hung up on this. This is not your Infusionsoft app name, and it doesn't matter what you call it. This is meant for you to be able to identify it easily. So if I go the Plan B Club Development, then the credentials I get for this will just simply be relevant to development for the Plan B Club. Website is just your website for the company involved. It is not something that is too crucial, because you can even change these values later. And then once you end up submitting everything, you click register after agreeing to the terms, and it will give you a client ID and client secret. That is what you will need in order to give somebody the chance to get to this screen right here. Your client ID and client secret will be required in order to be able to even be authorized to submit a request to this form on your customer's behalf. So that being said, go ahead and fill out, and if you haven't already, create a developer account and set up your first Mastery account with your client ID and secret, and that will give you what you need to get started. One caveat, one note: you will automatically be active. It will automatically be set to active the first one you do. Any ones that you apply for underneath this same login thereafter will have to be reviewed by Infusionsoft. Generally speaking, they say it takes 24 hours. I've heard people say it takes longer for them, but the bottom line is you can usually reach out to Infusionsoft and ask them to check on it for you, and they've been very good about that. So first one happens automatically, then any thereafter usually require a review. After getting your client ID and secret, you will request authorization. That's the allow deny screen, and what happens is it sends back a get response, and that's going to be sent back, and I'll show you code that illustrates this, but that's going to be sent back to your callback URL that you specify, which I will show you where that goes and how you specify that. And then it will send back the value code equals, and that's your authorization token. Okay, so you'll retrieve that and you use that in order to gain your access and refresh tokens. When you gain your access and refresh tokens, this is what it looks like, just like I showed you on the process, the test process that we had. And again, these values are not valid for anything. They have expired and they're no good. So you get an access token, you get a token type. At this point, it's always going to be bearer. Expires in. This is the number of seconds that the token is good for. In this case, 86,400 tokens just simply means it's good for 24 hours. This does not mean when it expires. It means how long it's good for. So, in other words, you either need to calculate today's date plus this amount in seconds, or you can store this amount at some point and then calculate how much time has passed by since it was stored. One way or the other, you're going to want to make sure you keep the information. You're going to have to do a date time calculation to know when the token expires. Refresh token. The refresh token is used to get a new set of tokens without having to use the allow deny screen. In other words, the user does not any longer have to be involved in this if you use refresh token and good token management, which we will cover. Scope is always going to come back as full. Now, the good thing about them using this right now is that it opens the door, or keeps the door open for them to be able to use scope limits. So let's say in that process we started out with where there is the allow deny on the screen, and I log in using my login, and I'm a user who has the user rights of agent, not admin. And let's say that the user rights for agents are I can view and edit any contacts that I personally create, but nobody else's. Well, this scope would then be able to allow limiting those results or my actions based on what my user rights were within the Infusionsoft app. And in which case, instead of full, we would get back, say, agent. for example. Now, that's not the case, so nobody. I'm not trying to tell anybody that that's even close to being ready. They haven't finished a lot of work, and they're still building a lot of stuff out here. So, at the moment, just count on it always being full, because that is your access rights that you're going to get with OAuth. Token management. So token management, I am not fond of using sessions, but I realize there are times that you'll need to, only because sessions are a temporary thing. Here's the problem. If you don't want your users, every time they log into, say you have a tool that does something like comes up with a report based on information in Infusionsoft, just as an example, and a user logs in and they're paying for a subscription to be able to use this tool. So they log in, and every time they log in, they've got to go to the allow deny screen, pick their app, and say, okay, now allow access to it every 24 hours. That's just inefficient. It's inconvenient. The users aren't going to enjoy the experience. It's just takes away from everybody what everybody wants to accomplish, which means it doesn't make it simple and easy and straightforward. So the best way is to manage with databases. The access token, token type, time to live, refresh token, and scope, of course, are all important. You're also going to want to record the date time that the access token, the actual JSON object, has been retrieved, so that you know exactly where you're starting with your time to live. This is how it's managed, and this is just the best way that we know in order to make sure that tokens don't expire. So essentially what happens is, when you get a token, or when somebody authorizes, you write a database row that has this information in it, and then you set up a small script on a cron job, or if you're on a Windows server, on Task Manager or a scheduler, and you schedule it to happen. Since tokens expire every 24 hours, what we do, at least what I've been doing, is after 20 hours have gone by since that token was created, I start attempting to refresh, and the refresh process runs a check every hour. So if there's nothing to do, if it's not 20 hours old yet, then it does nothing. If it is 20 hours or more old, then I have it go ahead and run a refresh request. I do it at 20 hours just to make sure, in case there is some problem with the server, whether theirs or mine, that I will have another opportunity to refresh the tokens before they expire. So the likelihood of there being any downtime whatsoever is extremely small, very slim, very unlikely. So point is that database is the best way to go. Using a refresh cycle on a scheduled service is the way to maintain it, so that your user has the best, smoothest experience possible without having to go through that screen anymore. So here's a code clip, an example of what code looks like. If you're not a programmer, don't worry about it. If you're just looking to get the high-level understanding, you can kind of let your eyes gloss over. If you are a programmer, or if you're just an avid do-it-yourselfer, or somebody who has just liked to play with it, or is thinking about playing with it, this all might be interesting to you. So I will explain what I have here. I'm using the ISDK, and it's recently been updated. I will have to find the actual version number, but a couple of developers have gotten together, updated so that it will use OAuth now instead of just the API key. And it will also, most recently, has also been updated to support webhooks. So that's a very interesting turnout. And the reason why this is important is because one of the issues about OAuth being used and deprecating the API key method is that the ISDK is structured completely differently than the current API or than use of REST. And if OAuth were required on the new API and the use of REST, and not with the ISDK, then what would happen is all of the integrations, and as I said, at least 50% of the Infusionsoft app owners are using some form of integrations, whether it be WordPress or custom integrations from developers like us, or from third-party apps, you know, all the graphing apps and the reporting apps and the back-end database storage apps. Just there's a myriad of API integration applications that are using this API key method, it would completely dethrone and offset everything. So what would happen is all the customers that we have that we've done integrations for or developed apps for or provide software as a service for, they'd be calling and they'd be saying, your work is not working. Your work has broken. And so developers right from the get-go were all like, man, what are we going to do? This is going to drive everybody crazy, and it's going to cause a frenzy. Well, the good news is that the developers and Infusionsoft worked together cooperatively to come up with a solution, and that was to figure out a way to get OAuth to work in the ISDK as well. So I'm using that as an example since this is really to go over the process, and the process is the same. It's not any different for the API method, and the process would still work the same for using REST as well. So here we go. Let's see, you would, in the case of the ISDK, this is the OAuth ISDK, you would require, in whatever language you're using, whatever that means, whether it be Ruby and you're doing an import, or Python, sorry, and you're doing an import, whether it be .NET and you're doing a require or include, or PHP and you're doing a require, you would include your dependency files, and then I do an include once for a file that I have for configuration, which basically defines all of these constants that you see, just for obscurity. Then, of course, we instantiate the application ISDK instance, and here's what happens. This is the nuts and the bolts of it, and I dumbed this down as much as I could. So basically this works on the principle that code is or is not present in the get response. So if code is not present in the get response, then what that is saying is we have just now gotten to the beginning of the process. So just having gotten to the beginning of the process, I want to make sure I set my client ID. Remember from Mastery, client ID and secret. So I set my client ID, my client secret. Now the redirect URL, what this is this means that when somebody clicks a link and they go to the allow deny screen, that when the allow button is clicked, the redirect URL is going to be where the OAuth process is going to return to, and return its actual code or the authorization token back to. So in this case, the way I have it structured, the redirect URL is this file on this server along with this file name. So I embed that. Now, you could use and build out the URL yourself, and that's possible. You can do that, but it's a lot easier to use the built-in get authorization URL. As long as you specify this information, then using the get authorization URL, in this case, because we're just using it for demonstration purposes, you can see that we assigned it as an href and an anchor tag. Having done that, we click the link, and the link sends us off to the allow deny screen. The allow deny screen, I select my app, I click allow, it comes back. Now only this time coming back to the file, code exists. So here it says if it's not set, then do this. But if it is set, it's going to ignore all this because code exists as a get parameter. So it's going to come down here, and again, just so it's clear, I made sure that I did it in both sections so it's clear. I made sure that I set the client ID and secret and redirect URL. And for good practice, I set auth to null to start with. Now, auth equals $app authorize, and looky here. Our authorization code is passed along with it, and what returns is that JSON string you saw in the web browser, and that JSON string you can use JSON decode, and it will give you either an object or an array with those elements in it. Ignore this file open, it was something I forgot to get rid of. And the variable dump is the reason why you see it in the browser tab that I had for you, which is no longer there. So essentially that's it. In a nutshell, Now, I realize there are a lot of particulars and questions, but the bottom line is that you first have to get authorization to have access. That authorization is to define the connection between you as a developer, or what the application that you wrote as a developer, and the application in Infusionsoft. So AB123 application gives you, the user that's logged in gives you permission to have access to it as a developer. Then you get your authorization token. The authorization token says you have permission to ask for access and refresh tokens. You ask for access and refresh tokens. The recommendation is to store it in a database and then have a refresh cycle that uses the refresh token to get a new pair of tokens. Now, I want to emphasize this. Your old tokens are no longer valid after 24 hours. It doesn't matter whether you run refresh. In fact, refresh invalidates them. You have to run refresh. It gives you brand new set of tokens that you have to then again update into the database, update your date time value so that you know when that token, those tokens have been valid from, and you know that the time is 24 hours. And again, you run the refresh, does the exact same thing. It keeps it refreshed, and so on and so forth. Then you have your access token. You use your access token to make API calls. Now, you do not have to add the access token to your API calls. I know that it's a little confusing in documentation because you might see an XML or the XML RPC where it shows as a parameter. Even in some of the actual function calls or method calls, you'll see that it includes it, and even on code complete you'll see where it includes it. You do not have to add it, and in fact in some cases it creates a problem if you do. So you don't have to add them. Once you assign it, once you assign that access token, you do not need to apply it to any of the calls. It's automatically the default. Then you make sure that you have a way for gaining that, getting that in your process from the database, and you will always have an active access token. You will never have to have a user going and reauthorizing every 24 hours. The method is sound and it works very well, and there's nothing is impossible, but there's very little chance that you will ever not have an authorized token. I hope all this helps, and since this is just the first run through and rough draft, I hope that whoever's watching it is kind, and please feel free to give any advice peer review wise, and if there's anything spoken about or not clear that may create misconceptions, or if there's anything in addition that could add further understanding, please feel free to let me know. I really would appreciate it, and I know that the community as a whole would as well. Thanks for watching.